Good evening, my friend. I'm glad you're here. Settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let the world outside grow quiet for a while. Tonight, we're stepping into the fog-laden streets of Victorian London slowly, gently, because the story waiting for you lives in the shadows where the gaslight fails to reach. Picture this. The night is cold enough that each breath leaves a pale cloud in front of you. The fog hangs thick over the cobblestones, softening your footsteps until they echo like distant whispers. The streets are nearly empty, save for the occasional rattle of a carriage wheel or the faint cry of a newspaper boy wrapping up his final calls. You walk down a narrowing alley, the kind Londoners avoid after dark, following a dim lantern ahead, your only guide through the murk. And then it appears. A tall, narrow boarding house leans slightly toward the street, as though listening for secrets carried by the wind. Its windows glow faintly through the fog, offering just enough light to suggest warmth, though not enough to promise safety. Inside, you imagine a fire burning low in a small common room, the orange embers pulsing quietly like a tired heartbeat. Yes, compared to the cold world outside, the boarding house feels almost inviting. Almost? But buildings like this, once structures built from thin wood and thick stories, hold more than warmth behind their doors. As you step inside, the air changes. Gone is the crisp bite of the night. Instead, you're met with a heavy blend of tobacco smoke, damp wool cloaks, and the lingering scent of boiled cabbage drifting from a distant kitchen. The hallway is dim, lit by gas lamps that flicker as though uncertain whether they want to keep burning. The floorboards creak beneath your steps, carrying your presence into rooms you haven't yet seen. And that's when the truth settles over you, almost as thick as the fog outside. This house, this temporary refuge for the weary, the transient, and the lonely, is more than just shelter. For many, it becomes a cage, a place where privacy dissolves into thin walls and watchful eyes. For others, it's a purgatory between the life they fled and the one they will never reach. And for some, it's a tomb where their stories end quietly, unnoticed. What looks safe from the outside hides an entire world of secrets within its walls. Behind each door lies a life half-lived, secret romances whispered by candlelight, betrayals disguised as kindness, scandals tucked neatly beneath thin blankets, and mysteries no tenant dares speak aloud. Every boarder carries something heavy here, something they hope the house will help them forget or hide. Tonight, you and I are going to open those doors. I invite you to walk slowly through these hallways with me, to listen to the quiet confessions in the dark, and to uncover the hidden truths tucked between the stairwell shadows. This is the forgotten world of Victorian boarding houses, a place where people lived side by side, yet remained strangers than strangers, bound together only by the silence of their secrets. If you enjoy these slow, atmospheric journeys into the past, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these sleepy stories alive, and I'd love to have you here for many more nights. It was a place of whispers, a quiet haven, nestled amidst the chaotic streets of Victorian London. But even in the relative safety of this small boarding house, there was something undeniably unsettling about the air. The low murmur of voices, the sound of feet shuffling down creaky floors, and the occasional cough or quiet sobbing carried through the thin walls of the old building. The house, standing like a crooked monument to forgotten lives, was home to many a transient space where strangers sought refuge, where the lonely came to hide, and where, for some, the line between love and despair was as thin as the walls they shared. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of tobacco, damp wool, and boiled cabbage. The boarding house, with its narrow hallways and rooms stacked on top of one another, never quite felt like home. The floors creaked underfoot, the windows let in little light, and the warmth of the common room flickered dimly in the evenings, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. It was the kind of place where you could exist without truly being seen until, of course, someone noticed you. And when someone did notice, everything changed. It was the usual pattern. Women, mostly young, far from their families and looking for work, found themselves walking through the front door of the boarding house. The promise of warmth and shelter, however fleeting, was enough to coax them inside. They came from various walks of life, some running from harsh circumstances, others simply seeking a place to rest before they moved on to something better. But once inside, they were bound together in the shared silence of life under one roof. There were the older women, perhaps widows, or those who had seen too much of life's cruelty. And then there were the younger ones, those like you, still full of dreams and hopes for a future that felt just beyond their reach. And in a place like this, where everything felt temporary, the possibility of something more, a feeling, a connection felt intoxicating. And it didn't take long for that connection to take root. One evening, as you were quietly reading by the window, a figure entered the common room, a man you hadn't noticed before. He was a new arrival, a solitary boarder with a quiet air about him. His presence was unremarkable at first, just another face in the sea of fleeting lives. But there was something in the way he held himself reserved, but with an undercurrent of something more that caught your attention. He wasn't like the others. The way he carried his coat, the way his eyes scanned the room as though looking for something or someone, something in his demeanor, piqued your curiosity. At first, it was just casual exchanges in passing, a polite greeting in the hall, a brief moment of eye contact. But soon, it became more than that. Late-night conversations in the dimly lit corners of the common room, shared looks that spoke volumes without a word. There was something magnetic about him, a presence that made you feel seen, something you hadn't felt since arriving at the house. He, like you, was new to this place, a transient soul navigating a world that often overlooked people like you. There was a familiarity in his eyes, a kind of sadness that mirrored your own. The connection, though subtle at first, began to deepen. There was an unspoken understanding between you both, a quiet agreement that you were both here for a reason, and perhaps together you could make this strange and uncomfortable place feel like something more. It started with simple words, quiet exchanges about the weather, about the food, about the trivialities of daily life in the boarding house. But it wasn't long before those words began to feel like an invitation, a soft and subtle pull. The touch of his hand on your arm as he reached for a cup in the common room, the quiet smiles that lingered too long, the way his eyes never quite left yours when he spoke. You had been warned about such things, the fleeting romances of boarding houses, the dangerous liaisons between lonely souls, but there was something so alluring about the possibility of escape, of something more than the solitude you had grown so accustomed to. You were young, and the world outside was harsh and unforgiving. But in his eyes, there was warmth, there was promise. One evening, as the fire crackled low in the hearth, he asked you to walk with him. The house had grown quieter as the other tenants retreated to their rooms for the night, and the air in the common room was thick with anticipation. There was a softness to the way he spoke, his voice low and inviting. "Would you join me for a walk? The night's too quiet to spend indoors." And so you walked, side by side, through the darkened streets of London. The fog clung to your skirts, and the gas lamps flickered dimly above you. It was on these walks, in the cool night air, that the forbidden moments began to slip between the cracks of your world. There, in the quiet of the streets, far from the prying eyes of the boarding house, you shared your first kiss, a kiss that felt both tender and dangerous, as though the world might collapse the moment it ended. The next days blurred together. The stolen glances grew longer, the conversations more intimate. A kiss behind the stairwell, a touch in the hallway, hands brushed in the darkened corners of the house. Every stolen moment felt like a breath of air in a world that had grown suffocating. But despite the intoxicating warmth of these moments, there was always the underlying tension, the weight of the secret, the knowledge that what was happening between you couldn't last. It couldn't. Boarding houses were not meant for love. They were not meant for hope or dreams or anything that could grow beyond the walls that separated one room from another. The love that flickered in the shadows was doomed before it had a chance to catch fire. And like the house itself, your relationship was built on fragile foundations, ready to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. It wasn't long before the consequences began to reveal themselves. Whispers began to circulate, soft, quiet, but loud enough for the walls to hear. Eyes began to watch, and doors that had once been closed were now open, revealing more than just faces, but intentions. Your secret, once protected in the dark corners of the boarding house, was no longer safe. You began to feel the weight of the eyes upon you, the suspicion in the air, the subtle yet ever-present watchfulness of the landlord, the disapproving glances of the other women, and the knowing looks exchanged in the hallways. Then, one morning, it happened. He was gone. Just like that, no trace, no goodbye. He had vanished as quickly as he had come. The room he had stayed in remained locked, and his belongings were gone. There was no explanation, no closure. The only thing that remained was the echo of his presence, the memories that would haunt the house long after he had left. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a passing affair, it was a scandal. And a scandal in a boarding house was a dangerous thing. You were left with the consequences, with nothing but your reputation hanging in the balance. There would be no forgiveness here. The secrets of the boarding house were sealed within its walls, and the tenants lived by the unspoken rule: never reveal what happens behind closed doors. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Your face became one more forgotten soul in the crowd. The space where his presence had once filled the air now felt suffocating, like the house was watching you, judging you. And in the quiet darkness of the boarding house, you were no longer just a tenant. You were a shadow of the woman who had loved and lost in the hidden corners of the world. The boarding house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a tomb, a place where stories were buried, where the echoes of romance, betrayal, and heartbreak would linger forever in the shadows. And in the silence of those hallways, your heart would forever beat in time with the secrets that the house kept. You walked slowly through the dimly lit hallway of the boarding house, your footsteps muffled by the old, worn carpet beneath your feet. The house creaks around you as if it has lived 1,000 lives, holding secrets within its walls that no one dares to speak aloud. The air is thick with the scent of tobacco, boiled cabbage, and the faint, musty odor of damp wood. Outside, the world may be bustling, chaotic, filled with noise and activity, but in here, the silence speaks volumes. This is a place where many come to find refuge, but few truly find peace. To the outsider, the boarding house might seem like a simple place, a temporary stop, a bed for the night, a warm meal shared in the common room. It's a refuge for those who have nowhere else to turn, a place where the weary can rest and the lonely can find a brief sense of companionship. But for those who live within these walls, it is anything but simple. It is a microcosm of life itself, unpredictable, chaotic, and filled with hidden struggles that go unnoticed by those who merely pass through. You are one of the many residents, bound by the rules of the house, though no one ever said what those rules truly were. They existed in the unspoken air, understood by everyone, and yet never clearly defined. They were the expectations placed upon the tenants by the landlords, the subtle social codes that governed everything from the time you were allowed to come and go to the unspoken hierarchies that existed among the residents. It's a delicate balance, a web of relationships woven into the very fabric of the house. The landlords, stern, watchful, and ever-present, were the rulers of this world. They set the tone, they set the rules, and their eyes never strayed too far from the tenants. They lived in the quiet, creaking shadows of the house, always listening, always observing. Their gaze was sharp, and their judgments harsh. But in a world where security was scarce, their presence was a necessary evil. They provided shelter, food, and warmth, but at what cost? Some rules needed to be followed, behaviors that couldn't be questioned, and boundaries that could never be crossed. But the residents? They had learned long ago that survival in this place meant more than simply following the rules. It meant navigating the subtle and often complex social structures that defined their lives here. The boarding house wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a battleground, one that involved more than just physical survival. It was a struggle for dignity, for respect, and for a shred of privacy. It was a daily dance of watching your back, knowing when to keep your head down and when to stand your ground. Each day was a game, a series of unspoken interactions. In the common room, there was always a crowd, some sitting quietly, others talking in hushed tones, their voices blending into a low murmur. The women, mostly young, clustered together, exchanging gossip and half smiles, while the men, more reserved, sat by the fire, their eyes often distant, lost in their own thoughts. Everyone, it seemed, was passing through, just temporarily living out their stories until they could move on. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet tension. No one wanted to truly belong. Everyone was afraid to settle too deeply into this transient life, to form real connections that could lead to something more, because in this place, nothing was meant to last. It was not a home. It was merely a stop. The boarding house wasn't just about the rules set by the landlords. It was about the unspoken rules that defined the relationships between the tenants. These social structures were fluid, constantly shifting based on who was in power and who had the most influence. There were the veterans, those who had been in the house the longest, and then there were the newcomers, the fresh faces who had yet to understand the delicate balance of power. The veterans, with their quiet authority, could sway the opinions of the others with just a glance. The newcomers, however, were often left on the outside, trying to navigate the shifting tides of the house without making a misstep. But the real survival in the boarding house came in understanding the subtle art of navigating these relationships. It wasn't enough to merely keep your head down and follow the rules. You had to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to offer a kind word and when to hold your tongue. The social dynamics were constantly at play, with each person trying to find their place, their role within the house. Some became leaders, others followers, and some remained in the shadows, unnoticed, but always watching. In the evenings, after dinner had been served and the plates cleared, the true nature of the boarding house came alive. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the murmur of voices grew louder as tenants gathered in the common room to pass the time. This was when the true personalities of the residents emerged. Some would gather around the fire, telling stories or discussing the latest news, while others would slip away to the privacy of their rooms, seeking solace in isolation. It was here, in the flickering light of the fire, that alliances were formed, secrets were shared, and small rebellions began to take shape. The rebellion wasn't loud, nor was it violent. It was quiet, subtle, and often unnoticed by the landlords. It was the refusal to follow the rigid schedules imposed by the house. It was the quiet defiance of the curfew, the whispered conversations about the rules that everyone pretended to obey but secretly ignored. It was in the eyes of the residents, those glances exchanged when the landlords weren't looking, the quiet understanding that they were all in this together. They might have been trapped in the same house, but in the shadows, they found small victories. They found ways to survive. The boarding house was a place where survival meant more than simply existing. It meant adapting, observing, and responding to the unspoken rules that governed the lives of the tenants. It was about creating relationships that lasted just long enough to survive another day, another week, another month. It was a place where everyone's story was tangled up in everyone else's, where secrets were shared and kept, and where no one ever truly knew who they could trust. It was a place where the past was never spoken of, and the future was always uncertain. And yet, despite all of this, the tension, the secrets, the unspoken rules, there was a strange camaraderie among the tenants. They lived in isolation together, but in that isolation, they found a shared experience. The boarding house, with all its dysfunction and secrecy, became a community of sorts. They were all trapped within the same walls, struggling to survive, to carve out a little piece of dignity and privacy in a world that offered neither. As you walk down the narrow hallway, the creak of the floorboards beneath your feet seems to echo the unspoken tension in the house. The boarding house, in all its strange, unsettling beauty, remains a place where people come and go, where survival is a quiet act, and where every resident plays a part in a story that never quite ends. It's strange how, in a place meant to offer shelter, the very walls seem to close in around you. The boarding house, with its creaky floors and thin partitions, feels more like a trap than a refuge. And though it offers warmth, it comes with the cold sting of suffocating surveillance. You'd think the hum of the gas lamps and the quiet chatter of your fellow tenants would provide comfort. But the reality of living under the ever-watchful eyes of the landlords makes everything feel tense, oppressive, like a performance you're always on the edge of forgetting. At first, when you arrived, the boarding house seemed like a temporary stop, a brief rest before moving on to something better. The world outside was harsh, cold, and unfriendly. This place, you thought, would be a sanctuary. But the sanctuary you found here was a fragile one, built on the assumption that you would behave according to the landlord's rules. And, at first, you did. You followed the curfews, kept to yourself, and made small talk with the other tenants in the common room, where meals were served and shared spaces were as close as anyone ever got to being comfortable. You remember the first few days, walking through the narrow hallways, the walls so thin that every sound, every conversation seemed to echo in your head. The house felt like a labyrinth, its rooms full of secrets and the promise of anonymity. But even before you could truly settle in, you began to notice the eyes watching you. At first, it was subtle, a glance from the housekeeper, a lingering stare from the landlord when you passed by. But then, it became more apparent there was no such thing as privacy here. You could hear the faintest sound of footsteps behind your door, and more than once, you felt eyes on you, watching your every move. The first time it truly hit you was when you noticed the landlord standing in the hallway, just outside the small, dimly lit room where you slept. He wasn't looking at you directly, but you could feel his gaze, like a presence pressing against your back. He was just there, as though he were waiting for you to slip up. He wasn't the only one. The housekeeper, with her stern eyes and meticulous attention to detail, was always watching, listening for anything out of place. You began to wonder how many times the door to your room had been silently checked. How many moments had been observed when you thought you were alone? The common areas, the dining room, the parlor were the places where you could interact with the other tenants, where you could briefly forget the strange sense of discomfort that hung over you. But even there, you were never truly free. Conversations were stilted, glances constantly darting toward the landlords, as if everyone knew that anything said out of line might be overheard. It was like living under a constant, invisible scrutiny, where the smallest deviation from expected behavior could lead to an unwanted consequence. No one ever spoke of it directly, of course. The rules were never written down, but they were understood. Behave, conform, and keep your head down. And then there were the moments when the landlords weren't just watching, they were listening. The walls, thin as they were, carried the sounds of whispered conversations, of things said in confidence, of secrets that would never be shared outside the house. But you couldn't forget that the same walls that kept you warm at night also acted as the house's ears. When you and the other tenants whispered late into the night, the sound carried through the cracks in the floorboards and the thin walls. You wondered if the landlord stood on the other side, listening, waiting for something worth punishing. It became clear that privacy, once considered a basic right, had become a luxury, one you could no longer afford in this place. You learned to navigate the house in quiet, measured steps. You avoided eye contact with the landlords, kept your conversations to a minimum, and did your best to be as inconspicuous as possible. The common areas became more like performance spaces than shared rooms, places where you could never truly relax, never let your guard down. You watched the other tenants, the way they interacted with one another, the way they kept their voices low, as if they, too, knew the consequences of being noticed. Everyone seemed to wear their role in this little play well. The men, polite but distant, barely spoke except when necessary. The women, young and old, kept to themselves, never revealing too much about their lives outside the boarding house. And the ones who lived in the house the longest, the ones who seemed to know the rules by heart, were the quietest, their eyes always alert, watching for anything that might attract attention. It was during the long nights, when the house was mostly silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards, that the tension seemed to rise. You could hear the sound of footsteps pacing back and forth down the hallways, the landlord making his rounds, checking the rooms like a silent, ever-present sentinel. The housekeeper, too, had her own routine, tapping lightly on the doors of each room to ensure the tenants were settled for the night. The soft rattle of keys in the lock, the whisper of footsteps passing by it, was impossible not to feel as if you were being watched. No matter where you went, no matter how quietly you moved, even when you closed your door and tried to shut the world out, there was always the feeling that the eyes of the boarding house were still upon you. The shared meals in the common room, which might have felt like a place of warmth, instead felt like a quiet interrogation. The food was simple gruel, bread, and a meager portion of meat for dinner. But it wasn't the food that made the room feel small. It was the ever-watchful eyes of the landlord, who seemed to be judging each movement, each bite. The other tenants spoke little, only exchanging the occasional pleasantry, but you could feel the tension in the air, a constant reminder that this was not a place of safety. It was a place of surveillance, where privacy was no longer an option, and the boundaries of personal space had been obliterated by the ever-present gaze of the people who were supposed to provide you with comfort. It was in these moments that the true nature of the boarding house began to sink in. The promise of warmth and refuge, of a safe place to rest your weary head, had been replaced by the quiet, unrelenting presence of control. The landlords weren't just providers of shelter, they were watchers, silent sentinels, ensuring that everyone adhered to the unwritten laws of the house. The tenants, too, had become part of this complex social structure, and every interaction, every glance, was governed by the invisible rules of survival in a space where privacy was a luxury and silence was the price of safety. The boarding house, with its dim lighting and creaky floors, had become more than just a place to sleep. It had become a constant reminder of the fragility of your existence, a place where the line between freedom and control blurred, and where the walls once meant to protect became the very things that confined you. And as you lay in bed at night, listening to the sounds of the house footsteps in the hall, the murmur of voices, the faint creak of doors closing, you couldn't help but wonder who was really in control here. Was it the landlords, watching from the shadows, or was it the tenants, living in silence, doing whatever they could to survive under the ever-watchful eyes of the boarding house? You realize, slowly, that you are not just a tenant here, you are part of a living system, a network of people bound together by the unspoken rules of survival. And in that quiet realization, you understand that in a place like this, the real challenge isn't simply staying alive, it's staying unnoticed, staying invisible in a world that thrives on observation, on silence, and on control. And as you drift off to sleep, the soft creak of the floorboards above you becomes a lullaby, a reminder that in this place, no one is ever truly alone, but neither is anyone truly free. The boarding house stands as a silent witness to the lives that pass through its door. Each room holds a story. Each tenant carries a burden. Yet in this place, no one speaks of their struggles. Instead, they linger in the quiet corners of the house, the soft flicker of the gas lamps casting shadows on their weary faces. They are here in this dimly lit world because it is all they can afford. After all, it is the last place that will accept them. After all, it is where they can simply exist, if only for a while. When you walk through the halls of the boarding house, you can feel it, the weight of unspoken stories, the quiet despair that wraps itself around the tenants like an invisible shroud. They come from all walks of life, but their reasons for being here are often the same: survival. You are no different, really. When you arrived, you were seeking something, a bed, a meal, a place to rest your head, but as the days pass, you begin to realize that it's not just a place to sleep. This house, these walls, they become a prison in a way, a place to hide, to forget, to survive. The first time you step into the common room, you notice how everyone keeps their distance. It's not just the physical space, though. It's the way people avoid eye contact, the way conversations are kept to a minimum, the way everyone seems to be carrying their own private weight. You notice the older man who always sits by the fire, staring into it as if the flames hold the answers to some long-lost question. You see the young woman, new to the house, who keeps to herself, her face hidden behind a veil of sadness. You see the housekeeper, who moves about with a sense of quiet authority, but whose eyes seem to betray a deep weariness. Everyone is here for a reason. Everyone has a past, but no one shares it. You find yourself becoming one of them, quiet, solitary, lost in your own thoughts. But even though the house is filled with people, you feel more alone than ever before. You can't help but wonder about the stories that brought these tenants here, the lives they left behind, the pain they carry in silence. You begin to realize that the boarding house, for all its noise and bustle, is a place of unspoken suffering. People come here not to start anew, but to hide from the lives they once lived, to escape the things they've tried to forget. There's the older man by the fire. He never talks, but you catch glimpses of the sorrow in his eyes. His clothes are worn, his hands rough from years of hard labor. You can tell he's a man who's lived a life full of regret, full of mistakes he can't undo. You wonder if the fire is the only thing that keeps him warm, both physically and emotionally. He never tells anyone why he's here, Perhaps he's forgotten himself. Or maybe he simply doesn't have the strength to speak of it. But you can tell he's here for the same reason as everyone else, because it's the last refuge, the last place where he doesn't have to face the truth of his life. Then there's the young woman, who never looks anyone in the eye. She stays in her room most of the time, only emerging for meals and never staying longer than necessary. You've heard the whispers from the other tenants, the ones who claim to know her story. She came to London to find work, they say. But something happened. Maybe it was a family tragedy. Maybe it was something darker. Whatever it was, it's clear she's trying to escape it. Her eyes, always downcast, tell you all you need to know. She is running from something. And in this house, with its walls thick with secrets, she's safe. No one here asks questions. No one cares enough to inquire. They've all learned to bury their stories deep inside, to live with their pain quietly, in the shadows. The housekeeper, too, holds her own secrets. You watch her as she moves through the house, cleaning, organizing, always with a purposeful air, always with the same tired expression. She speaks to no one unless she must, and she's always quick to return to her small quarters at the back of the house. She's been here for years, it seems, and she wears the weight of time like a second skin. You can sense that her life has been lived in the background, unnoticed by most. Perhaps she was once a young woman full of dreams, full of hopes. But now she is part of the boarding house, just another fixture, another face in the background. Her silence is louder than any words she could say. And you know she carries her own burdens, but no one asks her about them. No one ever will. And then there's you, another face in the sea of tenants. You arrived with the same hopes as everyone else. The hope for a place to sleep, a place to rest your weary soul, a temporary refuge from the world. You thought you could slip by unnoticed, that you could hide in the shadows and leave your past behind. But the longer you stay, the more you realize that there's no escaping it. The house becomes a mirror, reflecting your own struggles, your own past, your own mistakes. The other tenants don't know your story, but they don't need to. You see it in their eyes. The silent understanding that exists between people who are all here for the same reason, to survive. Each day in the boarding house is a struggle, not just for food or warmth, but for privacy, for dignity, for some sense of control over your own life. The house may offer shelter, but it offers little else. The rules are simple, but they are strict. Be quiet, be obedient, and stay out of trouble. And yet, in the quiet corners of the house, you begin to notice the small acts of rebellion: the tenant who sneaks a late-night drink in the common room, the woman who spends a little too much time with the man who comes and goes, the way people talk in low voices when they think no one is listening. It's all there, beneath the surface. These small rebellions are the only way to survive in a place that suffocates you with its silence. But even in this suffocating environment, there are moments of connection, flickers of life that break through the darkness. You see it in the way the older man looks at the young woman across the room, in the way the housekeeper pauses to offer a kind word, in the way a stranger will share a smile with you as you pass by in the hall. These moments are fleeting, but they are enough to remind you that even in a place like this, where the struggle to survive is constant and quiet, there is still humanity. There is still hope. The boarding house, for all its flaws and secrets, is not just a place of isolation. It is a place where people lost, broken, and struggling come together to survive. And in that shared survival, there is a bond, an unspoken understanding that binds them together. The house may try to strip them of their privacy, their dignity, their identities, but in the small moments, in the quiet gestures, they find a way to hold on to what little they have left. As you lie in bed, the sound of the wind howling outside the window, and the soft creak of the building settling around you, you realize that you are not alone. You are part of this shared experience, this silent struggle, and though no one speaks of it directly, the house knows your story, just as it knows the stories of everyone who has ever stayed here. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. The quiet acknowledgement that in this house, no one is ever truly alone. It was just after dusk when you first entered the boarding house, a place that promised refuge, but you soon realized came with its own set of unwritten rules. You had been warned about these rules, of course not in any formal way, but in the knowing glances exchanged by the other tenants. It was as if there were a secret language, a set of behaviors that you were expected to decipher by instinct alone. They were the rules of the house, and while they were never written down, they governed every aspect of your existence within these walls. The boarding house itself was a labyrinth of narrow hallways, dim-lit rooms, and creaky floorboards that seemed to sigh under the weight of every step. You could feel the years of stories, of lives lived and lost, pressing in on you from every side. There were moments when the house seemed to breathe, the walls whispering the secrets of its tenants, each corner hiding something unsaid. Yet, amid the silence, there was always the ever-present hum of control, a power that emanated from the landlord's rooms on the second floor, where the house's true authority resided. The landlords were the gatekeepers of this world. Their word was law, their gaze was sharp, and their power absolute. It didn't matter who you were or where you came from. If you stayed under their roof, you adhered to their rules, or you left. That was how it worked here. You had no say, no space to argue. The landlords were, in essence, the unwritten law of the house, and you followed their guidance, or their punishment followed you. In the beginning, you noticed the landlord's eyes more than anything else. The way they watched you when you entered the common room, their gaze never lingering too long but always present, as though they were taking measure of your every move. They would greet you, perhaps, but in that greeting there was always a question, an assessment of whether you belonged, whether you were worthy of the space you had taken up. No one ever spoke of this, but it was understood. You were a guest in their house, and while you were here, you were expected to follow the rules without question. The rules were simple, in theory. Don't be late for curfew. Stay out of the landlord's way. Don't disturb the peace of the house. Keep your room neat. And above all else, keep your mouth shut. But these rules, as seemingly straightforward as they were, became a constant source of tension. You learned quickly that breaking even the smallest of these rules could have consequences. One evening, a young man named Thomas arrived. He was in his early 20s, with wide eyes that seemed to reflect both curiosity and caution. He didn't know the house like you did. He was new. You watched him, observing the way he tried to blend in with the crowd, sitting quietly at meals and nodding along to conversations without really engaging. But one evening, you saw him break one of the unwritten rules. He stayed too long after dinner, the laughter from the common room growing fainter as he remained, lingering at the table, his hands folded in front of him. It wasn't so much what he did, but when he did it, the curfew had already passed, and the landlord's sharp eyes had already begun to scan the room. Thomas hadn't noticed the landlord standing in the doorway until it was too late. The moment the landlord's gaze fell on him, you saw it, the shift in the air, the sudden tension that crackled between the two. It wasn't just the curfew that was important here. It was the power, the control, and the landlord's gaze, cold and calculating, made it clear. Thomas had broken the house's code. The punishment would come swiftly, and you knew better than to intervene. The next day, Thomas was gone. His room, once filled with the quiet hum of a new arrival, was empty. You heard the whispers later the landlord had given him an ultimatum, leave or face eviction. The boy had left quietly, taking his few belongings with him. No one dared speak of it openly, but you could feel the unease settle into the house. The rules were not to be questioned, not even for a moment. The landlord was not always cruel, however. There were times, rare as they were, when they showed a different side. You remember one instance clearly. A young woman, Margaret, had come to the boarding house with little more than a suitcase and the clothes on her back. She was quiet, distant, and barely spoke to anyone. The landlord took notice of her immediately, watching her with a careful eye. For weeks, Margaret seemed to do everything right. She kept to herself, avoided trouble, and followed the rules. But one evening, as the fire crackled in the common room, you heard the faintest sob from her room down the hall. You didn't know why, but you went to her room. She was sitting on her bed, her back against the wall, eyes red from crying. When she saw you standing in the doorway, she quickly wiped her tears away, but the sadness in her eyes was impossible to hide. Without saying a word, you went to her, sitting quietly beside her. After a long pause, she spoke. "I've nowhere else to go," she whispered. "I've been running from something, and I don't know how to stop." It was the first time you had ever seen someone so vulnerable in the boarding house, and you realized that, for all the rules, for all the control, the house was full of people hiding their own secrets, people running from lives they couldn't face, people desperate for some semblance of refuge. You didn't know what to say, but you understood her words. You had your own reasons for being here, reasons you couldn't speak of, reasons you kept hidden beneath the layers of your own facade. The next morning, Margaret was gone. She had left in the early hours, her room empty, and no one ever mentioned her name again. You never learned her story, but you understood the weight of it. The landlord, though stern, had never raised his voice. He had quietly given her the option to leave without causing a scene, and just like that, she was gone. The house moved on as it always did, as though nothing had happened. This, you learned, was the true power of the landlord, not just in the rules they enforced, but in the way they controlled the fates of the people who stayed here. It wasn't about cruelty, not always. It was about control, about knowing that with a single word, they could send you away unnoticed, without a ripple in the calm. This was their house, their world. You were merely a tenant. But you weren't immune to it. No one was. The rules, though unwritten, were clear. They were the framework of this house, the boundaries within which everyone existed. They kept order, they kept things moving, and most importantly, they kept the house functioning. They kept it from becoming chaotic, from falling apart at the seams. But they also kept the tenants under control, constantly aware that one wrong move could lead to expulsion, to becoming another forgotten name in the sea of faces who had come and gone. You found yourself adjusting, learning the dance of survival within the house. You kept your head down, stayed out of trouble, and did your best to follow the rules. The landlord's eyes, ever watchful, were a constant presence in the back of your mind. You began to realize that survival here didn't depend solely on food or shelter, it depended on obedience. The balance between what you could do and what you couldn't do, the silent dance between yourself and the landlord, was what allowed you to remain. As the days passed, you became part of the house, just another name on the list of tenants, another figure moving through the corridors, another shadow in the hallway. You weren't a leader, nor a troublemaker. You were simply trying to make it through, just like everyone else. And in this house, surviving meant more than just avoiding the landlord's gaze. It meant living by the rules and knowing when to bend, when to stay quiet, and when to stay out of sight. The boarding house. in all its dim-lit, creaky-floored glory, was more than just a place to sleep. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared to be a simple shelter, a place where weary souls came to rest before moving on to the next chapter of their lives. Yet beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension, an energy that hummed through the hallways and seeped into the shared meals. Each tenant brought their own story, their own struggles, and while the house might have been a place of transient peace, it was far from peaceful. The truth was that living under one roof, bound by the same four walls and the same fragile sense of community, often meant surviving the silent wars that raged between the very people you had to share space with. You, like so many others, had come to the boarding house for shelter, a safe place to rest, to escape the chaos of the outside world, to hide. But in doing so, you had unknowingly stepped into a world where survival wasn't just about securing your bed for the night. It was about securing your place among others, each person vying for their own corner of safety, their own sense of comfort in a house that offered only the barest of security. The first thing you noticed was the subtle division between the tenants. Some had been here for a long time, those who knew the unspoken rules of the house, who had learned to navigate the complex web of relationships that existed within these walls. They were the quiet ones, the ones who watched everything, said little, and kept to themselves. Then there were the newcomers, like you, still trying to find your place in this transient, fractured world. But the most noticeable of all were the relationships that formed, and, in many cases, quickly unraveled. You could feel the competition in the air, thick and heavy, though it was rarely spoken aloud. It was in the glances exchanged over the dinner table, in the subtle body language of tenants who never quite relaxed, always on edge, aware of the fragile space they occupied. Everyone was constantly sizing each other up, gauging who was in control, who was weak, who was likely to become a problem, and who might be a potential ally in the never-ending dance of survival. It wasn't long before you learned the truth. Survival in the boarding house wasn't just about managing the landlord's rules. It was about navigating the complex web of relationships between the tenants, alliances, betrayals, subtle manipulations, and the ever-present tension of trying to maintain your place within this ecosystem. Everyone, it seemed, was vying for something, even if it was just a few moments of peace, a modicum of respect, or the tiniest shred of personal space. The quiet competition was often hidden beneath the surface, but it was undeniable. There was the older man, a former shopkeeper who had seen better days, now living in the boarding house after losing his business. He spoke little, but his eyes never stopped scanning the room. You could see it in his face, a kind of bitterness, a hunger for something, perhaps recognition, perhaps power that he had once known but lost. He kept to himself mostly, but you knew that if he saw an opportunity, he would take it. Then there was the young woman, newly arrived at the house. She had an undeniable beauty, but there was something else about her, something that made the other women in the house uneasy. She wasn't just pretty, she was calculating. Every word she spoke, every move she made, seemed designed to attract attention, to secure her place among the others. She would laugh too loudly, smile too broadly, as if to say, "I am here, and I deserve your attention." The other women, some older, some worn by years of disappointment, watched her with suspicion. They, too, had once been the bright ones, full of potential, full of hope, but time had worn them down, and they resented the reminder of what they had lost. And then there was you. You too had your own story, your own reasons for coming to this place. Perhaps you had fled from a difficult past, or maybe you had simply found yourself with nowhere else to go. You watched the others, your eyes darting between their movements, learning the unspoken rules of survival here. You knew, perhaps even more clearly than the others, that to survive in this house, you would have to find your place in the pecking order. You would have to carve out your corner of safety without stepping on anyone else's toes. But it wasn't always easy. You could feel the resentment building, the competition growing. The glances between tenants became sharper, the silence more oppressive. Conversations at dinner began to feel like careful negotiations, with each person trying to control the narrative, to insert themselves into the group without being overbearing. Sometimes, a glance would linger too long, or a word would be spoken that held more weight than it was meant to. The air, once thick with the mundane chatter of new acquaintances, began to crackle with tension. And then, one night, it happened. The young woman, who had been trying so hard to fit in, found herself on the receiving end of the older man's bitterness. You were there, sitting quietly at the table, watching as the two of them exchanged cold words. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a simple disagreement, a misunderstanding. But the words grew sharper, the tone more accusing. The woman, her eyes flashing, stood up abruptly, and before anyone could react, she stormed out of the room, her footsteps heavy as she ascended the stairs to her room. The tension in the room was palpable. No one spoke for a long time, but you could feel it. The ripple had begun. The old man's resentment, which had simmered beneath the surface for so long, had found an outlet. The young woman's ambition had collided with his bitterness, and the house, for just a moment, felt like it might fall apart. It wasn't just an argument. It was the culmination of all the unspoken resentments, the quiet struggles for control, the power dynamics that had been building since the moment the tenants had set foot in the house. Over the next few days, the atmosphere grew colder. The older man became more distant, while the young woman, though she tried to maintain her usual charm, seemed more guarded, more calculating. The other tenants, sensing the shift, began to pick sides, quietly aligning themselves with one or the other. The common areas felt less communal, more like battlegrounds where alliances were formed and broken without a word spoken. And then, just when you thought things might settle down, the sabotage began. It wasn't obvious at first, just small, subtle things. A misplaced item, a forgotten request, a stolen glance, but it didn't take long for you to realize what was happening. The young woman, in her effort to reclaim some of the power she had lost, began whispering slanders about the older man, painting him as someone unstable, someone not to be trusted. She spread rumors, just enough to make people question his motives, just enough to turn the tide in her favor. And he, in turn, began to withdraw, quietly sowing distrust in others, his bitterness turning into something more dangerous: isolation. You, too, found yourself drawn into this web of tension, unsure of which side to take, or whether you even needed to take one at all. You simply wanted to survive, to exist quietly in this space. But the dynamics of the house, the constant push and pull, made that almost impossible. As the days turned into weeks, you began to see how the boarding house was more than just a place to stay. It was a battleground, a place where every word, every action, every glance was a calculated move in the silent game of survival. By the time the first snow of winter fell, the house was no longer a place of refuge. It had become a place of silent wars, where people fought for control, for space, for dignity. The young woman and the older man had become the center of a storm, their rivalry spreading like wildfire. The others, the tenants who had once thought they could avoid the conflict, now found themselves caught in the middle. The boarding house, which had seemed like such a simple, temporary refuge when you first arrived, had revealed its true nature. It was a place of competition, of tension, of struggles that were fought quietly but felt deeply. In this place, survival wasn't just about the roof over your head or the food in your belly. It was about navigating the complex web of relationships, understanding when to speak and when to remain silent, knowing when to trust and when to protect yourself. And as you lie in bed, the soft creak of the house settling around you, you can't help but wonder how many other struggles are taking place within these walls. Struggles that no one will ever speak of, but that everyone can feel. The tension, the resentment, the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, they are the true essence of life in the boarding house. You arrived at the boarding house like so many others seeking refuge, hoping for a brief escape from the harsh realities that had driven you here. The world outside was cold, unforgiving, and you believed that stepping inside those old, creaky doors would offer you something different. A bed to sleep in, a meal to fill your stomach, a roof over your head. Simple things, really. Yet, as you walked down the narrow hallways, past the worn wooden doors and into the small room that would be yours, you couldn't shake the feeling that the house was more than just a place to stay. It felt like a trap, though you couldn't yet understand why. At first, it wasn't so obvious. You settled in, found your place at the table for meals, and exchanged a few polite words with the other tenants. You followed the unwritten rules: be quiet, stay out of trouble, keep to yourself. Everyone seemed to understand that this place was not meant to be a home. It was temporary. You were only passing through. That was the agreement. But as the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the house's rigid structure began to settle around you like a heavy cloak. The boarding house, which at first seemed like a haven, began to feel like something else entirely. It wasn't just the walls, though they were close and confining, or the thin floors that creaked beneath your every step. It wasn't the dim gas lamps that flickered in the hallways, casting long, unsettling shadows. It was the sense of being trapped within it, locked in place, with no way out but the door you had walked through. The rules of the house were clear, though never spoken directly. They were understood, like a code everyone lived by, a set of expectations that kept the house running smoothly. Curfews were enforced, meals were to be taken at specific times, and silence was expected after a certain hour. You had no choice but to follow these rules. The landlords, ever watchful, ensured that no one stepped out of line, keeping the house functioning with a firm hand. But what you came to realize in the quiet hours of the night was that it wasn't just the rules that kept you confined. It was the life itself, the very structure of the boarding house that locked you in. The rooms were cramped, small enough that you barely had space to stretch your arms. Privacy was a distant memory. The walls were thin, and you could hear everything: the conversations in the hallway, the sound of someone crying in the room next to yours, the hushed whispers of the tenants as they discussed their own struggles. The boarding house wasn't just a place to stay. It was a place where you lived in constant proximity to others. And in that closeness, a suffocating sense of confinement began to grow. You began to notice it more and more, the way the other tenants moved through the house, their eyes darting nervously, their movements quick and deliberate, as if they were trying not to attract attention. There was no room for error, no room for individuality. Everyone seemed to fit into the same mold, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. The house, you realized, was not just a space to sleep. It was a place to exist in the shadows, to follow the rules, to disappear. It was in the common areas where the tension was most palpable. The shared meals were always stiff and uncomfortable. The conversation, when it happened, was sparse, carefully measured. No one spoke of anything personal, nothing that might reveal too much. Everyone kept their distance, except for the occasional shared glance, those fleeting moments when two people made eye contact, as if to say, "I know what you're going through." But even those moments were rare, buried under layers of silence and unspoken understanding. The other tenants weren't just fellow residents. They were part of the machinery of the boarding house, each one just trying to get by without drawing attention. The more you observed, the clearer it became. The boarding house was not a sanctuary. It was a prison, a quiet, unspoken one. It had the same walls that separated people from each other, the same rules that kept people in their place, and the same rigid systems that made sure no one could truly live freely. Everyone was trapped in their own way. Some were here because they had nowhere else to go. Some had fled from abusive families, from lives they could no longer endure. Others, like you, had come to London seeking something: work, hope, a future, and had ended up here, in this place where survival was the only goal and nothing else mattered. The landlords, while not cruel, were constant reminders of the power they held. They knew how to keep everyone in line. The subtle glances they exchanged with one another, the way they kept the tenants in check, never allowing any of them to rise above their position. They were never overly harsh, never overtly domineering, but there was always a sense that they controlled the house in ways the tenants couldn't escape. The rules they imposed, unwritten, yet understood, were the fabric of the house. There was no room for defiance, no room for anything other than what was expected. And those who dared to step outside the lines? Well, you'd heard the stories of those who had been quietly evicted, disappeared into the night, without so much as a whisper. And yet, the true feeling of being trapped wasn't just about the house itself, it was the life that came with it. You and the other tenants lived in constant tension, each of you confined to your small rooms, to your limited worlds. You shared a house, but never a life. You ate together, but never truly shared anything. You slept under the same roof, but never truly rested. The constant pressure to conform, to adhere to the unspoken laws of the house, left you all suffocating under its weight. The more you tried to carve out a piece of yourself in this place, the more you realized how little room there was for you. You weren't supposed to be yourself here. You were supposed to be part of the system, to fit into the mold, to follow the rules. The boarding house, in all its worn-out grandeur, had become a cage, a place where you lived not by your own will, but by the will of those who controlled it. The air inside was thick, the walls closing in, the feeling of being trapped more and more palpable with each passing day. What was worse, perhaps, was the slow realization that you were not alone in this feeling. The other tenants, though they lived beside you, were just as trapped, just as lost. Each one carried their own burden, their own secret, but none of them spoke of it. There was no room for vulnerability here, no space to acknowledge the things you had left behind. The boarding house wasn't just a refuge from the outside world, it was a place where you left yourself behind, where you lost pieces of who you were in the pursuit of mere survival. And in that pursuit, you begin to understand that the real prison is not made of bricks and mortar, but of the systems that control your every move. The boarding house was more than just a building. It was a microcosm of the world outside, a reflection of the systems that bound you, that kept you in line. And the longer you stayed, the more you realized that escaping was not as simple as leaving through the front door. The true prison of the boarding house was the way it made you forget who you were, how it forced you to live by its rules, how it made survival the only thing that mattered. In the end, the house was not a sanctuary at all. It was a place where freedom, once a basic right, became a distant memory, something you could only dream about in the dead of night. As you lie in bed that night, listening to the house creak and settle, you realize something. You're not just living under its roof, you are living by its rules. You are part of its unspoken prison, and no matter how much you long for escape, you can't help but wonder if this is all you will ever know, this world of silence, surveillance, and survival. You drift into sleep, but the weight of it all lingers, heavy in the dark, suffocating in the quiet. You've spent countless nights in this house, nestled beneath layers of worn blankets, in a room where the walls seem to close in around you as the night drags on. The boarding house, once thought to be a temporary refuge, has become your home. You've grown accustomed to the dim light, the creaky floorboards, and the muffled conversations that drift up from the common room below. But there is something else, something subtle that you've noticed, something that lingers in the air, hanging like a shadow over every room. The house, for all its warmth, is a place that breeds sickness. It's not just the cold of winter that bites at your skin when you venture out. It's the sickness that seems to move through the house like an invisible, creeping force, slipping in through the cracks in the floorboards, into the shared space, and into the very bodies of those who live here. The air is thick with the smell of illness, even when it's not yet visible. It's in the sound of coughing that echoes through the hallways, the faintest wheeze that accompanies some of the older tenants when they speak. It's the pale faces that pass you in the morning, the ones who seem just a little too weak to stand, the ones who look at you with eyes that speak of exhaustion and illness that doesn't need words to be understood. This boarding house, like so many others in Victorian London, is overcrowded. It was built at a time when space was limited and people were desperate for shelter. The rooms, small as they are shared by multiple tenants, some for weeks, some for months, and some for years. There's no room for privacy and no space to truly rest. You've heard the other tenants murmur about the cramped conditions, the overcrowding, and the fact that the landlord, while kind enough to offer shelter, never seemed to worry about the state of the house itself. The air is thick with mildew, the windows barely open enough to let in a fresh breeze, and the walls seem to hold the heat in, making everything feel stale. And yet, despite the conditions, there's no choice. The rooms are cheap, if you can call them that, and the price for shelter here is a far cry from the cost of a nicer room elsewhere. For most of you, it's the only option. You come here because it's the only place you can afford. After all, outside, the world is cold, and the streets offer no warmth, no shelter, no security. So, you endure. You live in the house's cramped rooms, its narrow hallways, and you breathe in the air that feels a little too thick, a little too heavy. You learn to adapt, to make do, but that doesn't stop the illness from coming. At first, it starts small, a cough here, a sniffle there. You can feel it, the gradual buildup of sickness in the air, the way people's immune systems are worn thin by the constant pressure of living in a crowded, unsanitary environment. You begin to notice that the older tenants are particularly vulnerable. Their bodies, already worn from years of hard work, are no match for the sickness that seems to spread with every cough and every touch of a hand. There's Mrs. O'Leary, the elderly woman who always sits by the window, staring out at the street with her faded eyes. You've seen her shiver a few times, even when the fire in the common room burns hot. And lately, her cough has grown worse. You don't ask her about it, no one does, but you can hear it, the wet sound that rattles in her chest every time she speaks. Then there's Thomas, the young man who works in the market during the day. He's always seemed to be in good health, strong even, but lately, you've noticed the faint pallor to his skin. He's coughing now, too, and the way he moves slowly, as if every step takes more effort than it used to, makes you wonder just how much longer he can keep going. Soon, more tenants fall ill. You don't need to hear it in the common room to know who is suffering. It's the silence that gives them away, the quiet coughs in the hallway, the slower pace of footsteps, the muted conversations. The sickness spreads quickly through the house. As if it knows no boundaries, it finds the weak and preys on them. But it doesn't stop there. It creeps into everyone's lungs. A cold that turns into something worse. The typhus, the tuberculosis, the common cold, they all come together. A deadly combination, making their way through the house like a silent storm. And yet, no one speaks of it. No one says the words aloud. No one wants to acknowledge the truth that this house, which was meant to offer safety, is a breeding ground for disease. The landlord is nowhere to be found, and the housekeeper, though she does what she can, is overwhelmed by the demands of trying to keep everything running smoothly. The tenants, for the most part, suffer in silence. They've learned to keep their pain hidden, to hold it in until it becomes too much to bear. Those who are sick are left alone in their rooms, rarely seen except when they shuffle to the common room for their meager meal. The boarding house is silent in its suffering. When someone falls ill, the others avoid them as much as possible. There's no sympathy, no offer of help. People are too afraid of the sickness spreading, too afraid of getting sick themselves. The house becomes a quiet war zone, where illness stalks the tenants, and survival becomes about avoiding the inevitable. But what makes the illness even more tragic is the way the sick are left to suffer alone. The boarding house may offer food and shelter, but it offers no care, no true support. There are no doctors to tend to the sick, no herbal remedies shared in the corner. The residents, many of whom have weak constitutions and little access to medical care, are forced to weather the sickness on their own. A cough, a fever, a chill, they're all things you must endure quietly. The community is too busy, too caught up in its own survival, to truly care for the sick. And so, those who fall ill are left to suffer, their cries unheard, their pain unacknowledged. The worst part of it all, though, is the fear. You've seen it in the eyes of the others, the fear that the sickness will come for them next, the fear that the illness will spread faster than they can avoid it. It's in the way they move, in the way they keep their distance, in the way they breathe a little more carefully when they pass by a tenant who's clearly sick. The boarding house becomes a place of quiet dread, a place where survival means more than just avoiding the physical illness. It means avoiding the mental toll of living with it. You can feel it. The constant awareness of your own vulnerability, of how quickly everything could change if you so much as step into the wrong room, sit too close to the wrong person, or let your guard down for just a moment. The finality of it all hits hardest when someone dies. You don't see it coming at first. Death in the boarding house is not an event, it's an inevitability. When someone dies, it's almost as though the house doesn't pause to acknowledge it. The body is quietly taken away, and the house resumes its rhythm, as if nothing has changed. But you know that the house has lost another soul, and in its place, there's only the empty room, the silence where there used to be life. And yet, somehow, life in the boarding house continues. It continues because, as much as the sickness lingers, so too does the will to survive. Even those who are sick, even those who are struggling to breathe through the fever, carry on. They push through the pain, knowing that survival is all that matters here. They learn to live with the knowledge that sickness is always just around the corner, waiting to strike again. And so they continue, quietly, in the shadows, in the rooms that smell faintly of illness, in the hallways that have heard too many coughs to count. In the end, the sickness becomes a part of the house. It's not just the physical ailments that take their toll. It's the way the sickness shapes everything else. It seeps into the air, into the relationships between tenants, into the shared silences that grow heavier with each passing day. It's in the way people stop talking to each other, stop caring for each other, stop reaching out. In the boarding house, sickness isn't just something you catch, it's something you live with every day, every moment, as you wait for it to come for you too. You've been here long enough now that the smells are no longer jarring, unfamiliar. They have become a part of you, woven into the fabric of your days, lingering on your clothes, your skin, your memory. At first, when you first entered the boarding house, you were acutely aware of the scent. There was no escaping it, no hiding from it. It hit you as soon as you stepped inside. A mixture of unwashed clothing, stale food, tobacco smoke, and something faintly sour that seemed to hang in the air, seeping into the walls themselves. The smell of mildew, the smell of damp wood and old stone, the smell of things forgotten. It was the kind of smell that told you exactly where you were. It was a smell of survival, yes, but it was also a smell of entrapment. It was a scent that marked you, as though it clung to you, to your very soul. And no matter how much you bathed or changed clothes, you would never fully rid yourself of it. The boarding house, in all its dimly lit, creaky-floored glory, had an air of perpetual decay about it. The smell wasn't something that could be explained away by a simple spill or the remnants of yesterday's meals. No, this smell was embedded in the very bones of the house, in the fabric of its furnishings, in the damp corners that no amount of cleaning could truly reach. It was an ever-present reminder of the house's age, of its decay, of the lives lived and abandoned within its walls. You learned quickly that this smell, this odd, unholy mixture of stale bread, musty clothes, and the pungent tang of tobacco wasn't just something that passed through the house. It was something that settled in, became part of the place itself. It wasn't just the walls that carried it. It clung to your own skin, to your hair, to your clothing. You could walk outside, into the fresh air, and still, the smell of the house would follow you. It was like an invisible mark, a constant reminder of where you had been and what you had chosen to endure. At first, the smell was almost unbearable. It stung your senses, made you long for the clean, crisp air outside, for the smell of fresh flowers or the sharpness of rain. But over time, you began to notice something strange. The smell began to fade from your awareness. You stopped noticing it as much. It became part of the background noise, just another aspect of life in the boarding house, like the creak of the floors or the murmur of voices in the hall. You began to lose track of the passage of time. How long had you been living here? Days? Weeks? Months? It didn't matter. The house and the smells it carried became part of your routine, a constant companion that you no longer questioned. But for others, the smell wasn't something you simply got used to. For some, it was a constant reminder of their circumstances, of the choices that had led them to this place. Take, for example, Mrs. Aldridge. She had been here longer than most, a widow who had come to the city seeking work. When you first met her, you noticed the way she clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders, the way she seemed to retreat into herself, her eyes always darting around nervously as if she were waiting for something or someone to arrive. You learned quickly that Mrs. Aldridge had been trying to escape her past, and that past, though it had followed her into the boarding house, clung to her in ways the others couldn't understand. It was the smell, you realized, that haunted her. The stale food, the mildew. It reminded her of the years spent living in squalor, the years spent in a home where the air was thick with poverty, with despair. She would often sit by the window, staring out at the street, her hands trembling in her lap. You had heard her whisper to herself on more than one occasion, her voice barely audible, "I'll never escape this place. Never." For Mrs. Aldridge, the smell of the boarding house was a constant reminder of her inability to move forward, of the life she had left behind but could never truly escape. It was a reminder of the years she had spent trapped in an abusive marriage, of the years she had spent struggling to survive. The house, for her, was a place where she could hide from her past, but no matter how hard she tried, she could never outrun the smell. It was a smell that clung to her, like the ghost of her memories, like the weight of a life she could never truly leave behind. Then there was Thomas, the young man who had arrived only recently, carrying nothing but a small satchel and a faraway look in his eyes. You noticed him the first time he walked into the common room, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, his hands folded in front of him as he stared into the fire. There was something about him, something that made you wonder what brought him here. He was different from the others. He didn't seem to fit in, didn't seem to belong, and the smell, you could tell, bothered him. It was as though he couldn't quite get used to it, as if it repulsed him in ways that the other tenants had long since accepted. You saw him fumbling with his clothes, constantly adjusting his shirt collar, pulling at the sleeves, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. One night, after several weeks of silent observation, he broke the stillness. He stood up from his seat at dinner, his face pale, his voice shaking. "I can't stand it anymore," he muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "The smell, it's unbearable. It's all around us, in everything. I can't breathe." His words hung in the air, and for a moment the entire room fell silent. The other tenants exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared speak. The truth was, they had all felt it too, the weight of the house's smell, the way it filled every corner, the way it seeped into their clothes and their skin. But for Thomas, it was too much. He couldn't get used to it, couldn't accept the reality of his existence here. And so, he left. He packed his things in a hurry, his movements sharp and erratic, as though the air itself had turned against him. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He just walked out the door, and that was the last anyone saw of him. For some, the smell of the boarding house became a symbol of survival. It was a reminder of the fact that they had made it this far, that they had found a place to sleep, a place to eat, a place to rest. The smell, in a way, was a part of the survival game. It was something that had to be endured, something that became a part of you, a part of your existence in this strange world. The smell, to them, represented the harsh reality of their lives, but it also represented resilience, the ability to survive, to endure, despite everything. But for others, the smell was a constant reminder of their inability to escape. It was a mark of their entrapment, a reminder that no matter how far they had come, they were still stuck. They were still here, in this place, living in the same cramped quarters, breathing the same stale air, enduring the same struggle. For them, the smell was not just unpleasant, it was a reminder of everything they couldn't escape. You, too, began to realize that the smell had changed you. You had learned to live with it, just as everyone else had. You had stopped noticing it in the same way you once had. But every so often, you would catch a faint scent, a trace of something that reminded you of what you had left behind, of the life you had come from. It would linger for a moment, then disappear into the air, and you would wonder if anyone else could still smell it, if anyone else could still feel it. The boarding house, with its smells of decay and survival, had become your world. And as much as you tried to deny it, you were becoming a part of it too. The smells of the house, the smells of the lives that had passed through its doors, were now a part of you. The smell of survival, of entrapment, of something that could never truly be escaped. And so, as you lay in bed that night, the smells of the house enveloping you, you realized that the scent had become as much a part of you as the house itself. It was a part of the story you were living, a reminder of the life you were trying to build, and perhaps a reminder of the one you could never truly leave behind. You never imagined that a place meant for rest and safety would become a prison of its own, a place that, rather than offering you refuge, would pull you deeper into the shadows of a world you didn't fully understand. At first, the boarding house seemed like a simple solution, a place to sleep, to eat, to be for a while. The world outside, unforgiving and cold, felt like a distant memory when you walked through the creaky doors and into the dimly lit hallways of this old building. The other tenants were quiet, their faces unreadable, their eyes filled with something unspoken. They, too, were seeking a temporary escape. But as the days passed, the facade began to crack, and you started to see the darker truth hidden behind the walls of the boarding house. The first clue you remember was the odd mixture of secrecy and tension that hung in the air. It wasn't obvious at first, not something anyone would speak of directly, but it was there, an undercurrent of something off. It was in the way certain tenants moved through the house, the way they kept to themselves and avoided eye contact. You didn't know much about the people who lived here at first, but it didn't take long to realize that there were different kinds of residents. Some came and went, transient, looking for short-term shelter. Others, though, seemed to live here in silence, their lives wrapped in mystery, their faces never fully revealed. The landlord, always present, always watching, was at the center of it all. He was a man of few words, but there was power in his silence. He controlled the boarding house with an iron grip, keeping the tenants in check with a mix of vague rules and a heavy-handed sense of authority. No one ever dared challenge him. Those who did were quickly shown the door, quietly evicted, their belongings whisked away before they could protest. But for all his control, there was something else that lingered around him, something darker. You could feel it, but you couldn't yet understand it. One evening, as you sat in the common room, something caught your eye, a subtle interaction between the landlord and one of the men who stayed in the house. The man, a heavy-set figure with a face hardened by years of hardship, had entered the room with a stiff posture, avoiding eye contact with the others. The landlord greeted him curtly, but there was a brief exchange of words, followed by a small envelope exchanged under the table. You didn't catch all the words, but the tension between them was palpable. The man left soon after, his expression unreadable, his movements hurried. At the time, you thought little of it. Perhaps it was simply a business transaction. But as days passed, you began to notice more of these exchanges. The landlord, though seemingly indifferent, was always watching, always aware of everything that went on in his house. And yet, he never stepped in, never interfered when certain tenants came and went at odd hours, when whispered conversations passed between shadowy figures in the hallways. It was as if he were complicit in something, turning a blind eye to whatever was happening behind the closed doors of his boarding house. You started to hear rumors, two whispers in the hallways, hushed conversations that stopped as soon as you entered the room. The rumors were about the men and women who came to the house in the dead of night, who vanished into rooms with strangers, only to return hours later, their eyes glazed over, their movements stiff. Some of them were regular boarders, while others seemed to be transient, here for a night or two before disappearing as quietly as they came. You didn't know their names. You didn't know their stories, but you could sense their presence, feel the air shift when they entered the common room, the strange tension they carried with them. It wasn't until you witnessed it firsthand that the truth began to sink in. One evening, as you made your way back to your room, you noticed a group of men gathered in the dim hallway, their voices low and conspiratorial. You didn't want to eavesdrop, but their conversation was impossible to ignore. The man at the center of the group was speaking in low tones, his words clipped and hurried. "It's tonight," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The deal is happening. We need to make sure the landlord gets his share." You froze in place, a chill running down your spine. The word deal echoed in your mind, and you understood, perhaps for the first time, what the house was really about. This wasn't just a place for the lost and the weary. This was a haven for something darker, a world where transactions happened in the shadows, where money changed hands under the table, and where people lived lives they were desperate to keep hidden. The boarding house, once a place of refuge, had become a silent hub of corruption. Over time, the truth of the situation became clearer. The landlord's indifference wasn't just a trait, it was a strategy. He knew exactly what was happening in his house. He had turned a blind eye to the illegal activities that unfolded behind closed doors. There was theft, yes, stolen goods passed from one tenant to another, items taken from one room and sold quietly in the dark corners of the house. But there was worse, far worse. The whispers of prostitution, the exchange of money for silence, for favors, for goods. People came to the house with hidden agendas, some with nothing left to lose, others simply trying to survive. And in this place, they found a kind of haven, but not the kind of safety they'd hoped for. Some of the tenants, you learned, had become part of this world, forced, perhaps, into the shadows of society. They found that survival meant doing things they never thought they would. The woman in the corner room, whom you had once thought shy and quiet, had become a figure of whispered conversation. Her name was never spoken aloud, but you knew she had long since crossed the line between victim and perpetrator. She had become part of the underground system that kept the boarding house running, perhaps unwillingly, perhaps out of desperation. And then there was the man you had seen earlier, the one who exchanged the envelope with the landlord. You learned his name was George, and though he tried to keep a low profile, there was something unmistakable about him. His eyes always held a secret, something darker than the usual shame of those who lived here. He was no longer just a tenant. He was part of the system, a player in the game that kept the house running. It wasn't just about survival for him anymore. It was about power, about control. The truth, once revealed, was impossible to ignore. The boarding house wasn't just a place where people came to hide. It was a place where they came to get lost, to find ways to survive in a world that had abandoned them. The landlord, for all his cold demeanor, was not a victim. He was a facilitator, a keeper of secrets, a man who profited from the very darkness he chose to ignore. And the tenants? They were trapped in this world of hidden corruption, forced to become part of it or face being cast aside into the cold streets. You knew, then, that your presence in the house had been more than just a simple mistake. You were caught up in this web, whether you wanted to be or not. The lines between right and wrong had blurred in a place where the rules were unwritten, where morality had no place, where survival came at any cost. And now, you were part of the house's story, too, an unwilling participant in a system you had stumbled into. The quiet nights in the boarding house grew even quieter, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next secret to unfold. You couldn't unsee what you had seen. The whispers, the deals, the silent transactions, they were all around you, lurking in the shadows, just beneath the surface of the boarding house's everyday routine. No one spoke of it aloud, but everyone knew. And the more you stayed, the more you understood that, like the others, you had become a part of it too. And as you lie in your bed, the sounds of the house echoing around you, you can't help but wonder if there's any way out, if there's any way to escape this world of secrets, of corruption, and of silent complicity. The house feels like a cage now, its walls pressing in on you, its secrets becoming yours. And you realize that, perhaps, the only way out is to leave, but leaving is never as simple as it seems in a place like this. When you first arrived at the boarding house, the world outside felt cold and indifferent, its relentless demands weighing heavily on your shoulders. You had nowhere else to go, no place to rest your weary body. The boarding house, with its creaky floors and faint smell of tobacco and mildew, promised shelter, albeit for a short time. The thought of finding something temporary, something safe, was all you needed. You didn't expect much, just a place to sleep, a warm meal here and there, and a roof over your head to keep the cold at bay. Little did you know, the house you had entered was more than just a shelter. It was a graveyard for stories, stories that were buried deep beneath the worn-out walls, their owners forgotten. The tenants who filled the rooms of the boarding house were a motley group, some transient, some long-term. They were a mixture of the lost, the desperate, and the broken. They arrived for different reasons, but all of them shared one thing in common. They were trying to escape something. For some, it was poverty, the kind of poverty that stripped you of dignity, leaving you with nothing but the scraps that life tossed your way. For others, it was a history of abuse, the scars of their past still fresh and bleeding. And for a few, it was an illicit past, a history they hoped to outrun, to forget. But what you would learn over time, as the days turned into weeks and then months, was that for most of the tenants, the boarding house was not a refuge. It was a prison, a place where you could disappear, where no one would ask questions, where the world would move on without you. You could leave your past behind, but you would never truly escape it. You would become like everyone else, lost among the others who had come seeking the same things: refuge, rest, anonymity. The boarding house didn't offer freedom. It only offered oblivion. You noticed them, of course, the people who kept to themselves, the ones who spoke little and stayed in their rooms most of the time. They were the ones who never made any noise, who didn't draw attention to themselves. There was the man in the corner room who always seemed to be coughing, but never complained. You never learned his name, but you learned his routine, the way he would shuffle down the hallway late at night, his footsteps soft but determined, as though he were trying to make himself invisible. You saw him only in passing, his face always turned down, never meeting your eyes. He never asked for help, never spoke of his illness, never even acknowledged the other tenants. You wondered sometimes how long he had been here, how long he had been living in silence. But in the boarding house, no one asked questions. People were just there, filling space, existing in a kind of quiet purgatory. Then there was Mrs. White, the elderly woman who arrived a few months before you. Her clothes were always threadbare, her shoes worn thin from years of use. She had no family to speak of, no friends to visit. She was a ghost, a shadow of a life that had long since passed. You could hear her moving around in her room late at night, the sound of her coughs echoing through the thin walls. She never joined the others in the common room for meals, though you sometimes caught a glimpse of her sitting alone at a small table, staring out of the window with a vacant expression. She was always there, yet always absent, and after a while, she simply faded into the background, as if she had always been a part of the house, never to be seen or heard from again. It wasn't just the elderly or the sick who fell into this quiet anonymity. There were younger tenants too, who had their own reasons for disappearing. Take Sarah, for example. She was a woman in her early 30s, with bright eyes that seemed to hide a world of pain behind them. She never spoke much, but you could see it in her face, the kind of struggle that didn't need words to be understood. You overheard bits of her story in the hallways, how she had fled an abusive relationship, how she had come to the boarding house to start over, to leave behind a life that had broken her, But what she didn't realize was that the boarding house didn't offer new beginnings. It offered only more of the same. She found herself trapped in a cycle, living in a place where the past had no place but lingered, hanging in the air like the smell of stale bread. In the end, she too became just another face, blending in with the others, her story never told, her name remembered. For all their differences, these people shared one thing in common. They had come to the boarding house to escape something, but they had only found more of the same. It wasn't just the grim conditions of the house that held them prisoner, it was the life they had left behind, the memories they carried with them, the secrets they kept hidden. The boarding house, for all its warm meals and creaky beds, became their tomb. It was a place where stories went to die, where lives faded into the walls, where voices were silenced before they could be heard. You too began to feel the weight of it. The longer you stayed in the boarding house, the more you realized that you were becoming just like the others, forgotten, invisible, living a life that was nothing more than a series of routines. You didn't know how it happened, but it did. The days blended, the faces blurred into one, and the stories that had once seemed so important, the reasons you had come here in the first place, became distant memories. You had no idea how much time had passed since you first walked through those doors. The days became nothing but a blur, marked only by the routine of meals and the occasional conversation with a fellow tenant, whose name you could never quite remember. There was no one to ask questions, no one to care. The landlord kept to himself, barely acknowledging the tenants except when it was necessary to collect rent or to remind everyone of the house rules. No one questioned the way the house ran, the way it kept its secrets, the way it held its tenants in a vice grip of silence and routine. Everyone was just trying to survive, to get through each day without drawing attention to themselves. It was easier that way. It was safer. But as you continued to live in the house, you began to notice something you hadn't seen before. The boarding house, for all its flaws, for all the shadows that clung to it, was a place of survival. It was a place where people, broken and desperate, found some small semblance of safety. The tenants didn't always talk about their pasts, but they understood each other in a way that no one else could. They shared something unspeakable, something that tied them all together. But in the end, it didn't matter how much they shared. The truth was, they would all be forgotten. Their stories would die within these walls, their names lost to time. The boarding house, which had seemed like a temporary refuge, had become their tomb. Their struggles, their suffering, their lives, they would never be remembered. They were simply ghosts in the background of the house, their stories fading into the dust. You began to wonder, as the days turned into weeks, whether you, too, would become one of the forgotten ones. Would your name be lost to time, your story erased from the memories of those who had once shared this place with you? Would you, too, fade into the walls, becoming just another shadow in the boarding house? The thought was suffocating, but there was no escape. The house held you in its grasp, and its secrets were not yours to tell. As you lay in your bed that night, the silence of the house pressing in on you, you realized that the true tragedy of the boarding house wasn't just the lives it held, it was the stories it erased, the forgotten ones, the ones who had come seeking something better, had only found more of the same. They had been erased, their lives fading into the cracks in the walls, their names slipping into the void. And as you lay there, in the stillness of the night, you couldn't help but wonder, how long would it be before you, too, became one of the forgotten? The boarding house, in all its dimly lit, creaky-floored, smoke-scented glory, was much more than a simple shelter. To the unknowing eye, it appeared as just another building, a place where those with nowhere else to go could find a bed and a meal. But to those who had lived there long enough, it was something else entirely. It was a place of stories, of hidden histories that no one spoke about aloud. A place where the walls themselves held secrets, secrets that had been whispered over the years, shared in hushed tones and never fully acknowledged. At first, you came to the boarding house like everyone else, seeking refuge. You were tired, lost, perhaps running from something or someone, but mostly you were just looking for a place to rest your weary body. You didn't know what to expect when you arrived, but there was something about the place that felt strange. The hallway smelled of tobacco and dampness, and the floors creaked as if they carried the weight of countless footsteps from days long past. But there was something else too, something you couldn't quite place. It was in the way the tenants moved through the house, quiet, careful, as if they were all in on some secret that was never shared. The landlord, a man who seemed perpetually occupied, kept to himself, but his presence lingered in every corner of the house. The first few days passed in a blur. You adjusted to the rhythm of the house, the small rituals of meals, the shared silences in the hallways. But slowly, as time wore on, you began to notice the subtle things, the things that didn't quite add up. The way some tenants seemed to disappear into their rooms after curfew, never to be seen again until the next meal. The hushed conversations stopped as soon as you walked past a doorway. The soft sounds of laughter, or maybe something darker, that slipped under the doors of certain rooms late at night. And the worst part, the feeling that the house was alive with these secrets, that it was somehow watching, listening, waiting. One night, you were returning to your room after dinner when you noticed a strange sound. It was faint at first, like the rustling of paper or the scratching of a pen on parchment. You paused, uncertain, and then it came again, a whisper. It was hard to make out at first, but it seemed to come from the walls, from behind the plaster and the peeling wallpaper. You could feel the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Something was unsettling about it, something that made your pulse quicken. You shook it off, telling yourself it was nothing, just the house settling, the creaking of old wood. But as the days passed, you began to realize that it wasn't just the walls that held secrets, it was the very air of the house. The smell of the place seemed to carry more than just mildew and tobacco. It carried the weight of its past. The house had seen things, you realized. It had witnessed lives come and go, witnessed the rise and fall of its tenants, and it had stored those memories within its very bones. The cracks in the walls, the faint whispers behind closed doors, they were all a part of the house's history. A history that no one was willing to speak of. The more you observed, the more you began to understand that the house itself had its own dark stories to tell. It wasn't just the tenants who had secrets. It was the landlords too. The landlord, the one who owned the house and kept the tenants under his watchful eye, seemed to know more than he let on. He was always present, always observing, but never truly involved. He was like a shadow, moving silently through the house, his footsteps echoing in the hallways when no one else was around. You began to notice the strange exchanges that took place between him and certain tenants. Late at night, you would hear the sound of a door opening, a brief exchange of hushed words, and then a tenant would disappear for days at a time. The landlord would never speak of it, and neither would anyone else. And yet, there were whispers, murmurs, exchanged in secret corners of the house that spoke of things you couldn't fully understand. The landlord, some said, had a past of his own one that was better left forgotten. There were rumors that he had been involved in dealings that went far beyond simple rent collection. Some tenants claimed they had seen him meeting with shady figures, men who arrived at odd hours of the night, their faces obscured by the shadows. You overheard bits and pieces of their conversations, something about money changing hands, promises made, debts owed. It was clear that the landlord was no stranger to secrets. But how deep did they go? One evening, as you passed by the landlord's office, you overheard something that stopped you in your tracks. It was just a word, but it carried a weight that you couldn't ignore. The landlord was speaking to someone on the other side of the door, his voice low, almost inaudible. "The walls will keep it safe," he said, his words sharp and clear. "The house will protect it." You couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but the mention of the walls and protection stuck with you. It was as if the house itself was complicit in something, as if it were more than just a building. It was a keeper of secrets, a silent accomplice in whatever dealings were taking place. Days passed, and the tension in the house only grew. You began to notice more strange things: doors that were left ajar when they had been closed before, pieces of furniture that were moved without explanation, the occasional scream that echoed through the hallways late at night, followed by eerie silence. No one ever spoke of it, but you could see the fear in their eyes. The tenants were afraid of what exactly you couldn't yet tell, but it was clear that the house was no ordinary place. It wasn't long before you began to understand the full extent of the house's darkness. One evening, after a particularly tense dinner, a tenant you had come to know only in passing, an older man named Mr. Nate Hawthorne, was found missing. His room, once filled with the quiet sound of his breathing, was silent. His belongings were gone, and there was no trace of him. The other tenants whispered among themselves, but no one dared ask questions. The landlord, ever the figure of authority, remained strangely calm, not explaining, no word of reassurance. It was as if Mr. Hawthorne had simply vanished, as if he had never existed at all. The rumors began to circulate. Some said he had run off, tired of the boarding house and the life he had found here. But others, those who had been living in the house for longer, spoke in hushed tones of something darker. He was involved in something, one of the older women said, her voice trembling. Something he couldn't get out of. The landlord. He's always been involved in things like that. You began to piece together what had happened. The landlord, it seemed, was not just a figure of authority, he was a figure of control. A man who wielded power over the tenants in ways that went beyond mere rent and rules. He kept them under his watchful eye, knowing their secrets, manipulating them when it suited him. And when someone became a problem, when someone threatened to uncover too much of the house's hidden dealings, they disappeared. It wasn't just Mr. Hawthorne. There had been others, you realized. Others who had come to the house and left just as quietly, their names forgotten, their stories erased. They were the house's forgotten ones, the ones who had been consumed by its walls, swallowed whole by the silence that reigned here. The house kept its secrets, hid its stories, and protected those who controlled it. As the days turned into weeks, you felt the weight of the house's secrets pressing in on you. It wasn't just the landlord you had to fear, it was the house itself. The walls, once thought to be silent witnesses to the lives of the tenants, were complicit in the crimes that unfolded here. They held the secrets of the past, the ones that no one dared speak aloud. They held the memories of those who had come and gone, of the lives that had been quietly erased, of the stories that would never be told. The boarding house, once a place of refuge, had become a tomb for those whose lives had been swallowed by its walls, for those who had disappeared without a trace. You, too, were becoming a part of it, a part of its hidden history. And as you lay in bed at night, listening to the soft creak of the floorboards and the sound of footsteps moving through the hallways, you couldn't help but wonder, how long before your name was forgotten, too? How long before you became just another secret hidden within the walls of this house, never to be spoken of again? It wasn't long before you started to notice the strange disappearances. At first, it was subtle. A tenant who'd been around for a few weeks simply wasn't there the next day, their absence going unnoticed at first. But then it grew into something more unsettling. You would ask the others quietly, of course, but there was never a satisfying answer. "Oh, they left," someone would say, but they'd say it in a way that didn't quite feel right, as though the words were meant to be a distraction from something darker. At the start, you were too new to the boarding house to think much of it. People came and went in these kinds of places. After all, it was part of the rhythm, part of the life of those who lived in transient places like this, people with no roots, no home, no family to tie them down. But as time wore on and you began to pay closer attention, the disappearances started to feel less like a coincidence and more like a pattern. Some tenants seemed to vanish without a word, without any sign they had ever been there. Their rooms, once filled with their things, would be left empty, save for the faintest traces of their presence. A dusty coat hanging on a peg, a piece of crumpled paper on the floor, the lingering scent of tobacco in the air. No one ever asked questions about these absences. The house didn't seem to care much for them, as if it had no memory of the people who had come and gone. It was as though the house was indifferent to the lives that passed through its doors, indifferent to the stories left behind. The landlord, too, seemed unmoved. He was always present, always lurking in the background, but he never commented on the departures. It was as though he had grown used to it, as if the tenants were simply expendable to him, no more significant than the dust that settled on the floorboards. But as you lived there longer, you began to understand that it wasn't just the usual comings and goings of a boarding house. Something far darker was at play. The disappearances weren't always voluntary, nor were they always explained away by the tenants simply leaving of their own accord. Some left quickly, as if they were running from something they couldn't leave behind fast enough. They would pack their bags in the middle of the night, slipping out of the house without a word, disappearing into the streets like shadows, never to return. But others, some of the ones you had come to know a little, whose faces had begun to feel familiar, disappeared in a way that left you with a growing sense of unease. They didn't leave quickly, or at least, they didn't leave in the way you would expect. They left behind traces of their lives, signs that they had existed in the house. Personal belongings were scattered around their rooms, some even left undisturbed. A coat was left on a chair, a mug still half full on the windowsill. The smell of food lingered faintly in the air, as if the person had just stepped out for a moment and might return at any time. But they never did. You started to hear rumors from the other tenants, whispers that seemed to carry more weight than they should. "They don't leave. Not really," one of the older tenants said to you one day, her voice low, as though afraid to speak too loudly. "You'll see. You'll hear things." She didn't elaborate, and you didn't press. But her words stuck with you, growing heavier with each passing day. You began to pay more attention to the moments when people disappeared. One evening, you saw a young man, a quiet, nervous-looking fellow who had been staying in the room across the hall from yours, packing his belongings hastily. His movements were erratic, as though he were afraid of being caught, though you weren't sure by whom. You watched him from your doorway, unsure of what to do, unsure if you should intervene or even if you should care. But you couldn't ignore the way his eyes darted around, his expression one of pure anxiety. He didn't meet anyone's gaze as he passed through the hall. And when he left, he slipped out the door without a word. No goodbye, no acknowledgement. The next morning, his room was empty. Not a single thing was left behind except for the small, inconspicuous marks he had left, footprints in the dust, the faint smell of something stale in the air. It wasn't until a week later that you learned what had happened to him. He hadn't left willingly, it seemed. He had been evicted. but not in the way you would expect. The landlord had taken care of things, so to speak. You overheard a conversation between two of the long-term tenants, a hushed, nervous exchange about the issue in the room across the hall. It was then that you realized how easily someone could vanish in this place, how easily a person could disappear from the world without anyone really noticing. The stories were darker than you had imagined. There were whispers of tenants who had gotten involved in things they shouldn't have, things that went beyond the ordinary. Theft, gambling, debts, and worse. Some had gotten caught up in the underground dealings that had long since become a part of the house. Others had been pushed to their breaking points, forced to leave in the dead of night, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. You began to understand that there were forces at play in the boarding house, forces that you had not yet fully grasped. There were debts owed to the landlord, debts that went beyond rent, debts that were paid in silence and secrecy. But not everyone's departure was so easily explained. Some, you learned, simply vanished. There were no explanations, no signs of foul play, no indication of what had really happened. One of the women who had been staying on the floor below yours, a quiet, unassuming soul, simply disappeared one night, leaving behind nothing but a disarrayed room and a half-written letter hastily crumpled up in the corner. She hadn't mentioned leaving, hadn't given any indication that she planned to go. And when the other tenants inquired about her, the landlord, always a figure of few words, simply said, "She's gone." How? You later learned, through hushed whispers and the occasional late-night conversation, that these disappearances were not uncommon. The house had witnessed many such moments, people who arrived full of hope only to slip into the shadows and never be seen again. Some had left in fear, others had left in desperation, but most had left because the house had quietly erased them, swallowed them up like so many others before them. It was a strange kind of invisibility, one that didn't come from a lack of presence, but from a lack of care. In a place like this, you were only as important as the rent you paid, and if you could no longer contribute, or if your presence became a burden, you could be quietly removed, never to be spoken of again. It was this chilling reality that began to settle in your chest, like a weight that you couldn't shake off. The boarding house, which had promised shelter, had now become something far more sinister, a place where the forgotten were buried without a trace, where people came to disappear. The house had a way of erasing the past, of making people invisible. And the worst part, no one seemed to care. No one asked questions. No one remembered. You began to wonder, with a cold shiver creeping down your spine, how long it would take before you, too, would become just another name forgotten by the house, another tenant erased from its walls. You could already feel it, the subtle pressure to conform, to stay silent, to blend into the background like all the others who had come before you. The house had a way of swallowing people whole, of making them part of its history, even as it erased their names from memory. And as you lay in your bed at night, the silence of the boarding house pressing in on you, you couldn't help but wonder, how long would it be before you, too, disappeared? How long before the house decided you were no longer worth remembering? The boarding house was a strange place, a place where people came to stay, to rest, to seek refuge, but where the very air seemed to be thick with the loneliness of its inhabitants. The building, creaky and dim, housed many different souls, each with their own story, their own reason for being there. But beneath the surface of shared meals, exchanged glances, and quiet conversations in the common room, there was something unspoken, something that weighed heavily on the hearts of everyone who lived within those walls. It was the crushing weight of isolation. You, like many others, had come to the house seeking shelter. You were tired of the world outside, tired of the battles you had fought, the things you had left behind. You didn't expect much, just a bed for the night, a warm meal, and a place to rest your weary bones. But what you hadn't anticipated was the cold emptiness that came with it. The walls of the boarding house seemed to echo with silence, and as the days passed, you began to feel it more acutely. It wasn't just the physical space that felt empty, it was the emotional distance that seemed to separate you from everyone else. The other tenants, too, were living in a kind of quiet solitude. They shared the same space, passed by each other in the hallways, ate their meals together, yet no one seemed to truly connect. Conversations, when they happened, were sparse and polite, never reaching beyond the surface. No one ever asked how the other was doing, never inquired about what had brought them here, or what their lives had been like before the boarding house. There were no friendships formed, no genuine bonds created, and you understood why. The house itself seemed to discourage it. This was a place where you were meant to come, sleep, and leave. It was not a home. It was just a stop along the way, a temporary haven that did not encourage attachment. You began to notice the loneliness of the other tenants. There was Mr. Harris, the older man who had been living in the boarding house for as long as anyone could remember. He was always sitting by the window, staring out at the street, his eyes distant, as though he were waiting for something or someone to arrive. You never saw him speak to anyone, never saw him make an effort to engage with the other tenants. His meals were always solitary affairs, eaten in silence in the corner of the common room. He had no family, no visitors, no one to care for him. You couldn't help but feel sorry for him, but there was nothing you could do. No one ever spoke to him. No one ever asked why he was always so quiet. It was as though he had been forgotten, even by those who shared the same roof. Then there was Sarah, a young woman who had arrived only a few weeks before you. She was always in the background, always watching, but never speaking. You saw her once or twice in the common room, her eyes flitting nervously around the room, as if she were unsure of where to sit, unsure of who to talk to. She never seemed to make any effort to interact with the other tenants. Her meals, too, were taken alone, and you noticed the hollow look in her eyes, the kind of look that came from loneliness, from longing for something that seemed just out of reach. And there was Thomas, the young man who had arrived just after you. He was handsome, with sharp features and an easy smile, but you could see the sadness in his eyes whenever he thought no one was looking. He tried to act as though he was comfortable in the boarding house, as though he fit in with the others, but the truth was, he didn't. He never stayed long in the common room, and when he did, he would sit in the corner, nursing his drink, his gaze always wandering out the window, as though he were waiting for something or someone to come through the door. He didn't belong here, and yet, like the rest of you, he had nowhere else to go. You understood the unspoken truth of the boarding house. It was a place for the lost, for the lonely, for those who had no other option. The walls, though filled with the sounds of lives passing by, were ultimately empty, offering no solace, no connection. You began to wonder why you even bothered to speak to the other tenants. What was the point of reaching out when everyone was just passing through, living their lives in silence, waiting for something that would never come? You had no family, no friends who could visit you. No one knew your name beyond the walls of the house, and you didn't know theirs. The loneliness wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was a hunger that gnawed at you from the inside, a longing for human connection that never seemed to be fulfilled. The evenings were the worst. After the meal had ended and the other tenants retreated to their rooms, the house would settle into a heavy silence, the faint sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the distance, the soft rustle of sheets as someone turned over in bed. These were the only sounds that filled the air. The quiet was deafening. You lay in your bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered if anyone else was feeling the same way. The loneliness was almost suffocating, but no one ever spoke of it. It was as though acknowledging it would make it worse, as though talking about it would make it real. And then there were the nights when you would hear the soft sobs from down the hallway. You didn't know whose room it was coming from, but you knew that someone else was suffering too. The sounds were muffled, but unmistakable. Sometimes it was a soft wail. Other times it was the quiet, broken sobbing of someone who had nowhere else to turn. The cries would go on for hours. And though you wanted to help, you never did. It wasn't your place to interfere. You, too, were just passing through. Just another face in the crowd of souls who had ended up in this place by circumstance. As the days turned into weeks, you began to realize the depth of the silence around you. It wasn't just the noise of the house that was absent, it was the warmth of human connection. The small gestures, the moments when someone cared enough to ask if you were okay, the soft words of comfort exchanged between friends. These were the things that the boarding house could never provide. Instead, it gave you space to exist, to survive, but never to live. And that, you realized, was the true tragedy of it all. The loneliness wasn't just a feeling, it was a living, breathing thing. It crept into the corners of the house, settled into the cracks of the walls, and clung to the air like dust. You could never escape it. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for you to acknowledge it. And when you did, when you finally allowed yourself to feel it, it felt like the weight of the entire house, the weight of every soul who had ever walked through its doors, pressing down on you. You wondered, sometimes, how long it would be before you, too, became one of the forgotten, one of the faces who passed through without ever being remembered. The thought gnawed at you, but you pushed it away. There was no use in thinking about it, no use in contemplating the emptiness that seemed to surround you. All you could do was endure, to wait for the days to pass, to live in the silence that stretched out before you like an endless void. As you lay in bed that night, listening to the soft sounds of the house settling around you, you couldn't help but feel that you were nothing more than a shadow in this place, a shadow that moved through the corridors, never seen, never noticed, just passing through like everyone else. You closed your eyes and let the darkness take you, the weight of your own loneliness heavy on your chest. And though you longed for something more, something real, something to break the silence, you knew that in the boarding house, the silence would always be there. It was the only constant, the only companion you could count on. The door creaks shut behind you, the sound of its old hinges echoing in the quiet hallway, a sound that's both final and familiar. You stand there for a moment, staring at the worn-out door frame, your hand lingering on the cold brass handle. The air inside the boarding house is still thick with the memories of everyone who has come and gone. There are no grand gestures or dramatic farewells here. People come, they stay for as long as they can bear it, and then they leave quietly, often without a trace. The rooms that were once filled with their presence now feel empty, as though they were never really there. You've seen it time and again, the way tenants disappear, their rooms abandoned, their names forgotten by the house that held them. But as you walk down the creaky hallway for what you know will be the last time, you can't help but feel that something is lingering in the air, something that's never really gone. The boarding house has a way of making sure that its stories stay with you, even after you've stepped outside its doors. The house, in its own way, has become a place of memory. It holds the echoes of lives lived in shadows, the whispers of people who have come and gone, Their stories written not in ink but in the fading traces of their presence. It's in the faint smell of tobacco that lingers in the corners of the common room, in the dusty bookshelves that no one has bothered to touch for years, in the scuff marks on the floorboards where shoes have worn them down over time. The boarding house isn't just a building. It's a vessel of history, a keeper of the past, and its legacy is etched into everything it holds. As you walk through the hallway, your footsteps slow, your eyes scanning the doors you've passed so many times before. Behind each one, you can almost hear the echoes of those who live there, the voices of tenants long gone, the soft laughter, the quiet sobs, the conversations that never went anywhere, the shared silences. These rooms were never truly empty. They were filled with the presence of those who had stayed there, if only for a short time. Some were here because they had nowhere else to go, others because they had nowhere to return to. The reasons for their stay were many, but for all of them, this boarding house was a place where time moved in strange ways. Sometimes it stood still, sometimes it rushed by, but always it left its mark. You remember the people who stayed here, each one a piece of the house's story. There was Mrs. Lawrence, who came in the dead of winter, carrying only a small suitcase and a look of quiet desperation. She never said much, but you could tell she had a past she didn't want to speak about. She spent most of her time in her room, her door always shut, as though she were hiding from something. But every once in a while, you'd catch her in the common room, her eyes darting around nervously, never lingering too long on anyone's face. She stayed for months. Then one day, she was just gone. The landlord didn't say a word about it, and no one asked. But you remember the way her room was left behind, the faint scent of perfume in the air, the wrinkles on the pillow that never fully disappeared. It was as if she had never really left, and yet she was gone, just another name forgotten by the walls of the boarding house. Then there was Peter, the young man who seemed to always be just passing through, never staying for more than a few days before disappearing again. You'd see him in the common room, reading the paper, his eyes distant, as if he were waiting for something or someone. He didn't fit in with the others. He never quite seemed to belong. And yet, when he left, there was no fanfare, no goodbye. His room was empty the next morning, the bed neatly made, his things gone. The house moved on, as it always did, with no one really noticing. You never learned what happened to him, but you couldn't help but think that his story had been left unfinished. He had left behind traces, his half-finished letters, the book he had been reading, the empty chair where he had sat, but no one would ever know his full story. You begin to understand that this is the legacy of the boarding house, the people who came, lived, and left, leaving behind only traces of their lives. The boarding house doesn't remember them by name, but it remembers them in other ways, through the walls that hold their memories, through the faint echoes of their presence in the rooms that were once theirs. The stories are never told aloud, but they are felt in the air, in the creaks of the floorboards, in the hum of the house itself. But it's not just the tenants who leave their mark on the house. The landlord, too, has a role in the house's legacy. He moves like a shadow through the building, always there, always watching, but never fully present. He has his own stories, his own secrets, and though they are never spoken aloud, you know they are there. You can feel the weight of his presence in the way he moves through the house, in the way he keeps to himself, in the way he quietly enforces his rules. His influence is felt in every corner, in every whisper, in every moment of tension that fills the air. But like the tenants, he too is just passing through. He comes and goes, leaving behind his own traces, his own silent marks on the house. His legacy, too, is one of quiet presence, of unspoken authority, of a house that is always watched, always controlled. As the days pass, you realize that the boarding house isn't just a place for people to stay, it's a place where people leave a piece of themselves behind. The rooms, the hallways, the very walls are filled with their stories, their secrets, their lives. Some of them come to the house looking for a fresh start, while others come seeking refuge from the past. But no matter why they come, they all leave something behind. And in that sense, the boarding house is never truly empty. It is filled with the memories of everyone who has walked through its doors, the silent echoes of their lives lingering in the air long after they've gone. And now, as you stand at the door of your room preparing to leave, you can't help but wonder how long it will take before your own story fades into the background. You've been a part of this house, a part of its legacy, and yet, when you walk out those doors, you know that your name, your life, will be lost in the sea of others who have come and gone before you. The house will remember you in its own way, but it won't hold you in its memory for long. You will be forgotten, just as the others were. But as you leave, you can't help but feel a sense of connection to those who have come before you, to the forgotten souls who have left their traces behind in this house. They, too, were once like you, looking for something, searching for a place to call home, hoping that this house would offer them something more. And though their stories may have been lost to time, their memories, their echoes, will remain within these walls. They are part of the house's legacy, as much as the house is part of theirs. The door creaks shut behind you, and you step out into the cold, your footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The boarding house is now behind you, but its legacy stays with you. A reminder of the fleeting nature of life, of the stories that are never told, of the people who come and go, leaving only traces of their existence in the places they once called home. You don't know what lies ahead, but you carry the house's legacy with you. The silent stories, the forgotten ones, the traces left behind by those who passed through and were never truly remembered. As you stand at the threshold of the boarding house, the heavy door creaking shut behind you, a strange silence settles over you. The house, with all its creaks, whispers, and muted conversations, has now faded into the background, its once oppressive presence becoming just another memory in the city's vast, unrelenting hum. You breathe in the cool night air. But even as you step away from its threshold, the house's echo lingers. The stories, the secrets, and the lives that passed through those narrow hallways, though gone, are somehow still with you. The boarding house, while it may have been a place of temporary shelter for many, was so much more than that. It was a space where lives collided and diverged, where destinies were shaped by the invisible rules of survival, control, and secrecy. For some, it was a refuge, a place to escape from a world that had turned its back on them, a place to rest when the weight of the world felt too much to bear. But for others, it was a trap, a place where escape was not an option, and the very walls seemed to hold them prisoner. You've seen it yourself, the way some tenants arrived with hope in their eyes, only to be swallowed up by the house's unyielding grip, never to leave the same way they came. It offered comfort, yes, but it also isolated and controlled its residents. Beneath the layers of shared meals, casual greetings, and the quiet hum of daily life, something darker lurked. The boarding house was a place where people came to survive, but at what cost? The isolation it imposed wasn't just physical, it seeped into the hearts of its tenants, dividing them from the outside world and from each other. Though you shared walls, hallways, and common spaces, there was always a sense of separation, of emotional distance. A sense that no matter how many times you passed someone in the hallway, no matter how many meals you shared, you would never truly know them, nor they you. And yet, in those very moments of isolation, when the house was quiet and the lights flickered low, the stories came alive. There were secrets, countless secrets hidden in the walls, whispered in the corners, shared behind closed doors. Stories that were never told, never spoken aloud, never allowed to be known. The people who lived here, the forgotten ones, the broken ones, the survivors, carried their secrets with them like burdens they could never escape. The love affairs that were never meant to be, the betrayals that left scars too deep to heal, the lives that were lived in silence, unseen by the rest of the world. These stories didn't fit into the neat narrative of survival, but they were real all the same. Some romances bloomed in the shadows, fleeting moments of warmth in a cold, unforgiving world. But those romances were often doomed from the start, unspoken, unacknowledged, hidden in the spaces between the rooms, between the tenants. They left nothing behind but heartache and whispers. Then there were the betrayals, the broken promises, and the lies that twisted into the very fabric of life in the boarding house. Each tenant came with their own story, but it was never the whole truth that was shared. The truth was buried beneath layers of secrecy, wrapped tightly in the walls that surrounded them. As time passed, these stories faded, but the marks they left behind remained. They became part of the house's legacy. The unspoken betrayals, the quiet romances, the shared moments of fear and hope, they were written not in ink, but in the fading echoes of the house itself. The boarding house had become a keeper of memories, a silent witness to the lives of those who had passed through its doors. And now, as you leave it behind, you realize that those secrets are not gone. They are still there, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be uncovered. As you walk away, the quiet stillness of the night pressing in on you, the questions linger. What happened to the people who disappeared from those rooms? What stories did they carry with them? And what lives did they leave behind? What is lost when someone fades into the walls, their name never spoken again? The boarding house was a place of refuge for many, but it was also a place of erasure, a place where lives were erased, forgotten, and hidden away from the world. As the whispers of the past echo in your mind, you can't help but wonder how many others, just like those who came before you, are forgotten by the world. How many stories are left untold, hidden in the shadows of time, waiting for someone to uncover them. The boarding house may be gone, but its legacy remains. The people who lived there, the secrets they carried, the quiet tragedies they endured, they are not gone. They are part of the fabric of the world, woven into the stories we don't tell, into the lives we choose to forget. You pause for a moment, a faint shiver running down your spine as the cold air wraps around you. The night feels heavy, as though the weight of the past is pressing in on you, urging you to look deeper, to uncover what has been hidden. The boarding house is no longer there, but its stories live on. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces of the world, the whispers continue waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to ask the questions that have been left unanswered for so long. The real stories of survival, betrayal, love, and mystery are often hidden in plain sight, buried in the places we least expect to find them. The boarding house may have erased the names of those who passed through its doors, but it cannot erase the impact of their lives. They are still with us, their echoes carried in the spaces they once inhabited, their secrets woven into the very fabric of the world. And in the end, perhaps it's those forgotten stories that shape us the most, the ones we never hear, the ones that never see the light of day, but which, in their own quiet way, teach us the most about survival, about resilience, and about the darkness that resides in the forgotten corners of our world.